press the hash button. It's unheard of. Like, this is the most common way you own a huge domain within a Windows environment, and yet nothing out there really demonstrates for the user. This isn't a point when it's like, here's the secret techniques used by the hackers and pen testers to do this type of work. These things are so well known today that they're almost a given for a pen test, yet they're not really included in the tool sets. So we looked at what are the things that the tools today don't do, what are things we do as pen testers that we can't find a tool to do for us, that we spend all of our time on. So we actually used the internal RAP7 pen test team. We talked to a lot of our friends. We talked to a lot of our associates through both the Metasploit contributor program, through partners we have in the industry. And we came up with a list of here's the things we need to do to really make a tool that's effective for pen testers. Not just pen testers, but easy enough to use that your average admin can at least walk through some of the main things that a pen tester is going to do and get those out of the way first. I mean, there's no point in paying someone for 20 hours of work that's basically button clicking if you can do it yourself. So the primary parts of Metasploit Express are we want to make sure it's easy to use. So anyone should be able to start this thing up, get running, any platform, any supported platform. Right now it's Windows and Linux, and get rolling with it. It should be intuitive. It should do what you need to do. You shouldn't have to have a huge in-depth experience of security and a huge background and everything around pen testing to be able to use this thing. You should be able to prioritize your exploitable risk. You should be able to say, based on the results of this thing, I know what I need to go fix. I need to know what changes I have to make to stop this thing from working. The downside of working on a security tool like Metasploit is the better job you do at remediation and the better job you do of telling the user what to do, the less your tool is going to work. So it's kind of it's a bad cycle. Like, your best case scenario is when your tool is no longer useful in terms of how it works in the network. And that's the downside, but that's the practical truth. And what happens is we rarely see networks ever get to that level when it's not useful. And that's kind of scary. So we need to be doing more to push that envelope. And finally, it needs to be easily affordable. It can't be something you have to go spend the equivalent of a yearly salary on to bring a tool in-house, because for that price, you can just basically stick some guy in a box, hand him a bunch of manuals, and tell him to go for 2 months until they know what they're doing. Depending on who the person is and whether they like living in a box. At the same time, though, I mean, the value has to be there. The value has to be there for the tool to be worth that type of price. So this is what Metasploit looks like today, and a lot of people like this, use it. We have now fancy colors, and I actually like the console. I use it for everything. I can do just about everything in like 3 keystrokes, with 2 of them being tabs. It's great. If you know what you're doing, it's awesome. It's fast. You're good. Where we're going though looks a little bit different. So big spiffy UI with little clicky tabs, reporting, host interfaces, all that fun stuff. We'll get more into the UI side and screenshots, demos, and then the live hands-on demo after this. But the idea here is that you've got some pretty simple things you want to track. You want to look at your overview. You want to see what hosts you found. You want to see what sessions you have, your current active access to targets. You want to be able to generate reports and look at them. And sometimes you want to get your hands dirty and just jump in and run modules manually and do a particular task by hand. And you also want to track all of your background tasks. So that's kind of the basic layout. In this example, you can see it's 11 sessions are open, 4 passwords are cracked, found 357 hosts, 1,527 services. Pretty straightforward stuff. When we go to the demo, I'll show off a lot of the cool features. Basically, everything this product does on the front end translates to a Metasploit module on the back end with certain parameters and certain information. All the information about what modules run, how it's run, when it's run, that's all stored in the database, and you can export it back out as an RC script. They can either load, you just look at by hand to go do your work, or you can actually export it and load it into the free version of Metasploit and use it that way. So what we're trying to do is, if you're a pen tester and you're going on site to a customer and you do an automated pen test, a couple clicks into it, you're done, you got your shells, you can actually export automation scripts that repeat exactly what you did where it was successful. That's usable with the free version of Metasploit, and leave it behind with the customer so they can actually verify your work after they're done. So if they patch your system, they can go through and say, okay, now does the exploit work? And have a pretty, you're not charging them for it, it's just a nice add-on to leave behind. And because we have an open source product, because we have an open architecture and open everything for the most part, that's not threatening to us in terms of a commercial provider of tools. We think that's a really good use case. Not everyone's going to want to buy the product, not everyone's going to want to use it for what we use it for, but in cases where it does make sense, we want to make sure they're interoperable. So we asked a bunch of folks about what are the things that drive you crazy about pen testing. These aren't necessarily your hardcore pen testers, which have entirely different set of requirements. These are folks who have to do it day to day, either as their part of their main job or something they just do occasionally when they get dragged into bigger teams. Sometimes this applies to the hardcore folks as well, but they generally have their own mindset in terms of how they address these problems. So the biggest one here is I wish pen testing was faster. I mean, it's a long, long time to really do a good pen test across a large network. Even if it's only 200 hosts, you're probably going to spend a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I mean, you can spend as long as you want to on a given network and keep finding stuff. That's the great thing about it. I mean, even after you compromise a host, you have to go through all the data files. Once you go through the data files, you have to decrypt all the documents. Once you go through the documents, you find even more stuff. I mean, you just keep going and going when you start getting data. So what can we do to basically speed up the initial process, speed up the initial both entry and data gathering? So what we do with Metasploit Express is we deliver a really simple penetration testing workflow. You scan, you import, you run vuln scanners if you want to. Basically, that's all in the discovery stage. Then you can do things like brute force and exploit. And as you compromise systems, you can dump passwords through evidence collection. Then as you dump passwords, you can reuse those passwords automatically and compromise even further. So in one example, and this is kind of jumping the gun a bit, but for a particular target network I was working on, I scanned 6 machines. I found one of them was vulnerable to MSO 8067. It was supposed to be vulnerable. It was a target box. It was a certain level of a target that was supposed to be vulnerable. I ran the evidence collection in Metasploit Express on it, dumped the password hashes, and then scanned the entire network and told it to try it again. Now just try just the password hashes that I pulled before. Well, now I've gotten to 15 machines, and one of those wasn't a target box. One of them was just someone's workstation that had a shared account on it. So I said, okay, let's compromise that. Let's dump the password hash. Let's try it again. I got it to 35 machines. Again, got it to 65 machines. Again, I finally ended up with 97 sessions across a network that was theoretically secure. Like, every patch was installed on every other system on the network except for that one target box that I happened to scan. But what happened was because one person shared passwords on these 2 boxes, then another 3 people shared passwords in 3 other boxes, and so on, you kept widening your circle of access. And I did the whole thing through Metasploit Express in about 20 minutes. And that type of testing usually takes a long time to do by hand. It's usually a pain in the ass if you're using existing security tools for it. So that's one example of the things we're trying to do with Metasploit Express. The automated exploitation uses the exploit ranking system automatically. So you say only run the safe ones, only runs exploits of this level. And it goes through the entire Metasploit module set. If you happen to add your own module to the module tree, it's going to go ahead and load those things up and run it just like normal. So as long as you've got the right rankings in your own custom module kit, you can use your own existing modules, no changes with Metasploit Express. We have probably the easiest brute force system ever. We have a brute force button, and you click it and it brute forces. Now, if you want to get like granular, you can actually go through and check off protocols and tune things and say fast, deep, specify your own credentials. But by default, it just does stuff. And what it does is actually pretty interesting. It uses not only all the defaults, but it'll actually tune things based on the target network. So if you enumerate, as part of the scan process, if you enumerate the user accounts of one Windows machine or even a Unix box or Mac OS X box via SMB services or via Finger on a Solaris machine or an old, whatever you have sitting around running Finger, it'll then use those usernames automatically in the brute force. If you compromise a password in any system, whether it's SMB, whether it's a brute force someplace else, whether it's part of evidence collection, it then reuses those credentials again across all the systems. So it's a really neat way to kind of keep sharing, use information network-wide to generate passwords and possible usernames across every other service. So this is a lot of fun for SMB because you can pass the hash trick. For other protocols like SSH, it's a great way to find a default account that people have the same default account across the entire network. You say, what was the default password we used when we did imaging of these systems? Okay, now enter that one into the text box. Now let's run the whole thing and make sure no one else still has that password set. So really common pen testing tasks and even security auditing tasks are much easier to do through this framework than anything I've found so far. The shared password detection stuff is awesome. Anytime you've got a password that's been found, it automatically gets used unless you tell it not to. And you can do a brute force of just the known passwords, which is a great way to see whether the passwords you found so far are being used elsewhere. And of course, you can manage multiple background tasks. It doesn't really have a limit on it, but depending on how fast your machine is, you probably don't want to go over 20 or 30. But for most situations, you're only going to run 3 or 4 at the most anyways. The cool thing about the development team is it includes 3 former pen testers on the team itself writing this code. So as we're going through this, we're like, does this make sense? Is this something I'm actually going to want to use on a real network? And our worry is this is going to end up like that Simpsons episode where Homer gets to build a car. And he starts, the thing ends up having like 4 steering wheels and 3 hoods and 5 wheels on it. But we think what we have is actually usable, even though it is kind of specialized for pen testing, we think it is broadly usable, and hopefully the UI will make it more usable to folks even without a strong security background. So next. I wish my tools interoperated. Just right now, tools are terrible at doing stuff. One of our researchers, Joshua Abraham, wrote an entire XML parsing toolkit that all it does is take data from disparate tools, connect them together, and let you do cool automation tricks. So kind of like a Unix pipeline for existing open source security tools. And that's great, but that doesn't really apply to most commercial products yet. So for Metasploit Express, we deliver a native integration with Rapid7's and Expos. You can actually run an Expo scan directly from the user interface, look at the results, import it, everything from there. You can integrate directly with Nmap. We actually use Nmap internally. We don't hide the fact we don't use Nmap. We actually have a license to use Nmap. It's one of those cases where, as a company, we're really focused on when we use open source, we're very proud of the open source that we use, and we're not trying to hide it. So if you know exactly what you want to get done with Nmap, you can basically run your own Nmap scan, import it into it, and use it. I mean, we're not going to try to say that our scanner is better than Nmap. We're going to say that Nmap is the best scanner and use it. And that's generally the approach we take for a lot of the product development, is we're not going to reinvent wheels when we don't have to, especially when there's already existing great solutions out there. We can import data from different scanners, even scanners that aren't Nexpos. So I think at this point we support for QualScar, Nessus 1, Nessus 2, MBE. We should